Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Fantom and what our risk indicator makes of its recent price action. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So what I'm showing you here on this graph is the price action of Fantom over time, color-coded based on the output of our risk indicator, the upside-downside potential indicator. 5 is high risk, -5 is low risk. So what I'm showing you here is the long-term version of the UDPI. This is a version of the model that cares about moves that play out over months to years, kind of a longer time preference. I'll show output from the medium and short-term UDPIs in a minute, but I'm just going to focus on the long-term for now. So what you can see is that we had, out of the summer, gotten up to these really high risk zones, this kind of local top, these high risk zones that we had to end up correcting off of going into December. But then something that was interesting that Fantom did as risk kind of cooled off is it started realizing that upside potential. It had been kind of accruing upside potential as it corrected down into these kind of zones. It started realizing it, started really pumping, showing strength in bearish conditions, which I think was reassuring to those who are bullish on Fantom, that its ability to show strength in such adverse conditions. Now, given how bearish the market was, it wasn't surprising to me that Fantom wasn't able to continue pumping beyond around this point. Here, getting up to around its previous all-time high, and now we've been correcting since. So now I think the question is, do we have to keep correcting before we can kind of find a bottom? Do we just start consolidating from here? What might happen? So let's take a look at our raw outputs of the UDPI just to get maybe a better idea of maybe what the model thinks is plausible coming up here. So the UDPI -5 to 5 on the y-axis here, this is just the long-term UDPI over time. So you can see that right now, kind of coming off of that summer, then bouncing off in December, we're up at around 1. So that means from the model's perspective in the coming months, it thinks that the Fantom has more realistic room to the downside to the upside, but it's not totally imbalanced, right? We're not all the way up here. So this does not mean that Fantom has to dump back down here. You know, Fantom could just continue to consolidate for a while, and then risk should also cool off in that kind of a situation, or I would expect risk to cool off if Fantom really kind of show establish support where it is right now. Or if Fantom does correct, then risk will follow along with it. But really, in the long term, UDPI thinks that there's a bit more downside than upside that's realistic. And also, in these bearish conditions, I would be shocked if Fantom could just go crazy and start realizing all this upside when the rest of the market's trending down precipitously, right? Nothing's impossible. Anything could happen. That certainly could happen. I would personally find it very surprising if Fantom could just go parabolic while the rest of the market is so bearish. And so in some ways, when you're looking at the UDPI output, you have to keep in mind that broader context, right? If you're in a really bearish market condition, are you really expecting risk to be able to get back up here? And so from my perspective, during these times, I don't see that being very likely. And so as Fantom started pushed up here, and certainly if it would push higher, I'd get more and more skeptical of the sustainability of that move. I would see getting up to 2, for example, as being a lot riskier in these current conditions, or about as risky as, for example, like we were here in the middle of a bull market up at 4. I would start seeing these as being very risky in these really bearish conditions because there's so much pressure on people to take profits. So even if there is plausible upside potential in bearish conditions, you always have to keep in mind that it might not be as likely for that to happen. Again, that's stuff that's extraneous to Fantom, right? The model is making its predictions based on what it knows about Fantom. It doesn't know about the broader crypto market and what's going on, or the broader macro market, which in my opinion is really what's dragging down the crypto markets right now. The model's not worried about that. And so you have to interpret the UDPI output in context with these more macro factors, these factors that are extraneous to the asset that you're focusing on. So that's just my 2 cents. I personally would see these kind of levels being really risky right now if Fantom could go back up to them. I think it's probably more likely that Fantom will have to have its risk fall further before a lot of meaningful upside can be realized. That doesn't mean that Fantom has to correct further, has to dump in price to get down there, but it probably just can't go parabolic. It's probably gonna have to consolidate for a while to get back down there. Now again, anything could happen. So certainly it could go to the upside. None of this is financial advice. You should make your own decisions and interpret this data as you see fit, but that's just my interpretation. So let's look at the other time frames of the UDPI. So the medium term cares about moves that play out over weeks to months. Short term, moves that play out over days to weeks. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and one of the reasons why I did get kind of short-term bearish on Fantom in that pump coming out of December into early January was because we got so elevated on short-term risk. We got well above 3 on short-term risk during that pump during a super bearish time. And so when I saw that, I was like, okay, Fantom is probably at the end of this run right now, because this move is eating up all the short-term, a lot of short-term kind of upside potential in really bearish conditions. So I would expect a profit taking to happen from there, and to be unrealistic for the move to start realizing some of this longer term upside potential that it might have had. So the medium term, got up to 2 here, and now it's been correcting downwards. Short term is actually returned back to 0. So in the short term, now the UDP is actually a little bit undecided. It thinks that Fantom could maybe has equal amount of upside and downside potential that's realistic. So in the short term, who knows? Maybe Fantom can put in another rally. It's just that I would not expect it to be a rally that goes into price discovery and shoots off to the whole new level of price. I just wouldn't see that as being very likely. I think probably the best case scenario would be to go back, test some of those all-time high levels, maybe be able to put in a slightly higher high, but I would still find that surprising in current market conditions. I think sentiment in the market would have to reverse somewhat before I'd be more confident that Fantom can just go break off to the upside and go parabolic. But I can be wrong. I could absolutely be wrong. So take that with a grain of salt. That's just my interpretation. But really, my interpretation of this data is that Fantom is kind of overheated for where we are in the market right now, in the broader sense, in the macro sense, that when the rest of the market tends to be in these low risk levels, kind of they're realizing a lot of their downside potential, the fact that Fantom is kind of an outlier means that it's maybe not sustainable for it to be able to keep that kind of strength. Doesn't mean it has to correct. I think risk could fall if it just consolidates at its current levels for a while. But certainly big moves to the upside I would see as unlikely. But that's not to say that I'm bearish. I want to be very clear here about Fantom. I am not bearish about Fantom overall. And I want to now talk about why I'm not bearish on Fantom in a broader sense, in a more fundamental sense. Because again, my thesis now is that the macro conditions are holding Fantom back. I think if we had different macro conditions, I would have expected Fantom to go nuts a long time ago. And let me talk about why I'm kind of bullish on Fantom from a more fundamental perspective, where I just think it's in a nice setup right now, at least currently, where it is. We'll have to watch and see what happens if it stays this way. So I'm showing you here DeFi Llama. I talk about this a lot, but I think this is important to talk about in the context of Fantom, because I think DeFi and Fantom are narratives that are kind of interwoven. The DeFi adoption on Fantom, in my opinion, has been a big part of its price appreciation. Obviously not the only part. Many more use cases for Fantom than just DeFi, but I think a big part of it. And you can just see it when you look at the numbers, right? So Fantom is currently number 5 in total value locked in DeFi of all layer 1 blockchains. So it's in kind of rarefied air up here with just some of the big players. And it had this past month massive inflows in the total value locked. Currently sitting up at 50% up, even after a 20% drawdown in the last week of the total value locked on it, which is quite remarkable. I think that there's a lot of money flowing in. And you see it's got a lot of protocols on it. It's only a few other chains that are able to boast of having more DeFi protocols on them. Almost 3 times as many as are on Solana. And one of the things I think is interesting to note about Fantom is if you look at its market cap to total value locked ratio, so that's exactly what it sounds like. You just take the market cap of Fantom, which currently stands at around 5 billion, a little bit below. You just divide that by the total value locked, and you get your ratio. And what people use this ratio for is essentially it's a way of potentially in some people's uses, a way of comparing relative valuation of different blockchains to each other in terms of are they over or undervalued, and using DeFi adoption kind of as your baseline or the total value locked. So the idea is that the lower this market cap to total value ratio is, the more undervalued the chain is. And then you usually just look at it in context of other ones to get a better sense of where it might stand. And so you'll notice that for Fantom, it's the lowest of any of these chains that we're looking at right here. In fact, any of these ones in the top 15, it is the lowest market cap to total value locked, and it's sitting at number 5. And I think that's just kind of remarkable, right? The fact that it has more value locked on it than its market cap, and it's number 5 is something I think is quite remarkable in some ways. And so this is just one of the reasons why I think it's hard to be especially bearish, at least in the sense that for layer one protocols, it seems like the market, at least until this more recent kind of more bearish phase we've entered, during kind of the bull market that went into November, it really seemed like there was a lot of value being placed on layer one blockchains that had a lot of adoption, and DeFi adoption was certainly one of the metrics that seemed to matter. Look at Avalanche. Avalanche, by no small part, in my opinion, catapulted itself way up in price on the back of its DeFi adoption. And then a lot of that money potentially had been started to shift, as happens with DeFi. You have kind of those mercenary DeFi people who just go chasing the high yields. But a lot of money then started flowing into Fantom. And so I had been thinking that Fantom could be the next one to pull an Avalanche. And of course, macro factors interceded. We had kind of the bull market got cut off by, in my opinion, macro uncertainties that kind of dragged down all of the markets, including crypto. And so, in an alternate reality, I think it's very plausible that Fantom could have been the next one to pull an Avalanche and go crazy. But as we are now, we maybe are just kind of in a holding pattern where that upside potential is getting kind of pulled down by those macro factors. And that would kind of align with what we've been seeing on the UDPI, where Fantom is trying to realize that upside potential, it's pushing, it's trying to get there, but it just can't do it because of the broader macro conditions that are holding it back. Now, again, this is all just me talking about the current state of affairs. DeFi, total value locked, this is quite in flux in recent years. These rankings shift, things move around. So it'll be useful to keep an eye, in my opinion, keep an eye on these metrics to see what's going on. But I think if Fantom can maintain its place more or less, stay relevant, stay in these top rankings in total value locked, and especially if it maintains this low market cap to TVL ratio, it just seems like it's offering, from a more kind of valuation perspective, it seems to be offering a nice setup from that perspective. And if the market were to flip bullish all of a sudden, and especially if more time passes and its risk resets more from what we're just looking at, I think Fantom could be offering a very nice setup in that kind of condition. Now, again, not financial advice. This is just my take on what's going on here. But that's just something that I've been thinking about with Fantom. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's a little bit hard to be particularly bearish on it. And especially if we just look at the market cap, $5 billion for crypto, at least at this point in crypto, is not huge. And if we just think about Fantom going up to the level of something like Avalanche, Avalanche is sitting up here, over 3 times that. It had been well above that in its full run that it had done. So it's not unrealistic to think about Fantom in some future bull run being able to go up to many multiples of this market cap. 20 billion you could easily be achieved if it does something like what Avalanche does, if not more. Especially if it's a full-on bull market, it could go on well above that. Now, again, this isn't to say that Fantom can't correct further from here. That market cap can't fall further, anything like that. Doesn't mean that the setup has to stay. If anything can change in a bear market, who knows what'll happen. But just right now, if the market suddenly flipped bullish, I would think that Fantom is sitting in a pretty nice position right now. But that's just my opinion. And certainly when you look at Fantom's just its price action, just to show this on TradingView here, it's pretty remarkable what Fantom's been able to do just in this cycle, right? If you do just a measurement from the absolute bottom to its absolute top, you're talking about a 225,000% increase to the upside. That's pretty darn remarkable, right? And even just what it was able to do coming out of the summer, being able to put in a 2,300% move to the upside, and it's still sitting, at over 1,000% up to the upside from the summer. It's a pretty remarkable thing. Now, that doesn't mean this has to keep on happening, that Fantom has to continue to be as explosive. But just as I'm mentioning, just from a valuation standpoint, it wouldn't surprise me if it could realize some nice upside in a new bear or bull market, should we see that sometime soon. But again, who knows what'll happen? Who knows if we'll flip bullish anytime soon? That's really not in the control of Fantom. It's, in my opinion, its fate's a little bit out of its hands right now in that perspective. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. What I'm going to be watching for is, does this kind of setup persist throughout this kind of bearish phase? And if it does, I would be quite bullish should things start flipping bullish, and especially if risk is able to reset a lot by that point. But again, not financial advice, just my perspective. So to wrap up, I just want to talk about the current exact UDPI levels across the different time frames. So here we have long term 1.09, medium term 1.4, short term negative 0.03. So in the long term, the UDPI still thinks that there's more realistic downside and upside potential in the coming months for Fantom. So it's something to keep an eye on, but certainly upside potential that's there. So, should the market flip bullish, then certainly there's upside that could be realized. Same in the medium term. And short term is just basically undecided right now. But you can actually see that risk has been plummeting off of that pump that we got going into early January. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. If we keep on going down to more oversold areas, if we kind of stay undecided in the short term, have to wait and see what happens. But from the model's perspective, in the short term, equal amount of realistic upside or downside potential that could come. So just something to keep in mind. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with the UDPI, we're all going to make it.